Hello, very good day to you. I'm Alex Burkill, meteorologist and presenter here at the Met Office, and it's Tuesday, which means it's time for another deep dive. Plenty to talk through today. I'm going to be looking at sea surface temperatures, the hurricane season in the Atlantic, and also something a bit global too. But first, I will be covering the weather for the UK. Now, as always, leave any questions you have, leave any comments, and we will be answering some of them in the Weather Studio Live on Friday. It'll be Honor and me. She'll be posing the questions to me this Friday. Remember, you can catch that at 12:15 live or watch it back anytime after Friday if you miss it during the lunchtime. Otherwise, also hit the like button, hit the share button. I don't like asking you to do that, but if you make sure that you do, then maybe I'll stop asking. So do me a favour. Then let's look at the UK weather. And it's fair to say it's quite unsettled, not totally unsettled, actually, across many parts of the UK. Today is a largely fine day, but the jet stream is pushing in. We have our polar front jet, which is the driving force for more changeable, unsettled weather to come as we go through this week. There will be rain, there will be some heavy, perhaps even thundery showers, even some blustery winds. Let's look a bit at the detail. Now, Honna's doing the 10-day trend tomorrow, and I don't want to tread on her toes too much. She gets angry if I do, and I don't like making Anna angry, but I do need to mention the weather that's happening across the UK at the moment. So let's look at the overview quickly. And there is, like I say, the jet stream pushing its way across. As we go through into Wednesday, that's going to be driving this weather system through, and so that's going to lead to rain for many places. Even the rain spreading across eastern areas, and all the time through this week, the wet weather is generally coming in from the west. So eastern areas, most of the time, avoiding the heaviest rain, but actually on Wednesday, most places will see some wet weather at times. Then as we go through into Thursday, we have this low pressure in control still, and that's going to bring quite a blustery, showery theme, particularly towards the northwest. Plenty of showers piling in from the west, and that occlusion coming round, that could bring some more persistent rain. And that's the similar theme that we take into Friday, really. There will be more showers coming through because of this low pressure just to the northwest of the UK. But how much rain are we going to see? Well, here we have our rainfall totals for the next few days, but I want to dive into things in a little bit more detail. Now, if we put on our 3-hourly rainfall totals for tomorrow and just run it through, and you can see there will be these heavy showery bursts pushing their way northeastwards across many places. Now, we're looking at the potential for 10 to 20 millimetres in an hour or so, maybe 30 millimetres in an hour. And if you get any of those heavy bursts of rain building up, well, a few places could see quite a bit more than that throughout the day as a whole, particularly across some western parts of Scotland, southern Scotland. Here we could see some high rainfall totals, 50 millimetres, maybe even a little bit more. And I think the thing that I wanted to draw your attention to, particularly as we go through later Wednesday, I already mentioned it, but that wet weather is pushing its way across pretty much the whole of the country. So most places will see some heavy showery rain. Now, it's not a really wide band of rain. If I just get the UK picture up, it's not a wide band of rain as such. It's quite a showery mess. So even within this, it is going to be hit and miss, the rain. And so there will be some drier periods, and not necessarily everywhere will see the rain, but it's going to be quite widespread. So my point just being eastern parts, which don't get a lot of the rain through this week and haven't had a huge amount recently, they will see some at times through tomorrow. Then as we run through, and as I mentioned already, so the wet weather pushes its way from west to east and northeastwards. There's a band of heavier rain as we go through the start of the night, but that clears through, and then we end up in this showery setup. And because of the low pressure here, the winds coming from the west, northwest, it's always across western parts where the showers will be most frequent. A few towards the east, but much fewer than across western parts. They won't be as heavy, they won't be as intense, they won't be as thundery. And I alluded to it earlier, the occlusion that's wrapping round is going to bring some more persistent rain into parts of Scotland. And then it's a similar day really on Friday. More showers coming in from the west, northwest, and still some more persistent rain across parts of Scotland at times too. Perhaps slightly fewer showers maybe as we go through Friday, and the more persistent rain clearing through Scotland as we go through the early hours, but generally another showery and quite blustery day. I did want to show you the winds, and actually we can use this one if we, so these are our gusts for the next few days. And yes, there are some blustery winds as the system comes through on Wednesday, but not especially strong. But by Thursday and Friday, particularly across western parts of Scotland, even towards Orkney and Shetland as well, some strong gust gales, perhaps touching close to severe. So a windy spell. Most places it's going to be quite blustery, but the strongest winds will be across parts of the northwest of the UK. But then, to understand what's going to happen through this weekend, and as we often see, it's worth looking at what's happening the other side of the Atlantic, because we are watching an area of low pressure that's developing. It's around Thursday time that it looks like it's going to start to develop on the eastern side of the US, and then it pushes its way eastwards. It's going to get caught up in this jet stream that I mentioned earlier and then come across the Atlantic. Now, if you caught my week ahead forecast, which went out on Monday, it was a good one. If you missed it, you should go check it out. But if you did catch that, you'd have seen me talk about the fact that the model run at the time from the Met Office wanted for this low to go across the jet and move from the warmer southern side to the colder northerly side. And when it does this, that leads to it deepening quite quickly and intensifying. And so then that was indicating of the potentials for some very wet and windy weather as we go through particularly Sunday. However, the latest Met Office model wants to keep the low on the southern, the warmer side of the jet, and keeps it as quite a flabby feature. And so as we go through this weekend, I mean, Saturday at the moment actually looks mostly fine for many places. There will be some showery rain, but mostly fine nonetheless. But then this low comes across mainly towards southern parts of the UK as we go through Sunday. Now, if this comes off, yes, there would be some wet and windy weather across southern parts, but nothing especially unsettled, just a wet and relatively windy day for some. However, this isn't the forecast track that we think is most likely now. So we've taken it on board that the Met Office model, the most recent one, is suggesting this, but we've looked at previous models and we've looked at other models, ECMWF, GFS, for example, and the majority of them are more in line with what the older Met Office model was saying, in as much as the low is likely to come across the jet stream, end up on the colder northern side on the left exit region, and then it's likely to intensify and deepen as it comes closer towards the UK. Now, we can see that if we look at our postage stamps from ECMWF for this coming Sunday at midday. And the majority of them, not all of them, but the majority of them have a pretty deep area of low pressure somewhere towards the northwest of the UK. So take member 21, for example. It looks like it's got, a relatively deep area of low pressure just to the west of Scotland, maybe the north of Northern Ireland. And a lot of them have something very similar. Some of them are a bit more developmental. Member 20, for example, brings it a little bit further across, as does 19, actually, albeit that one doesn't look anywhere near as deep as some of the others. And a few of them are more in line with the most up-to-date, the most recent Met Office model, which keeps it all a little bit less developed and a little bit further south. But the majority of models going for a fairly deep area of low pressure, but most likely to stay towards the northwest of the UK. So we've kind of ended up with the chance of three possible scenarios as we go through this weekend, particularly Sunday and into Monday. So the most preferred solution, we're going with around a 70% chance of this happening, is for a deep low to develop, come across the Atlantic, and then end up somewhere just to the northwest of the UK. Now, this will be quite a mature feature, but it's going to bring, or if it comes off, it would bring some wet and some windy weather, particularly to parts of the northwest of the UK, and also maybe the far north of Scotland. We're talking gales, maybe even severe gales in some places. And there'll be some wet weather sweeping through as that comes in, and then some hefty showers following in behind. The second most likely solution, we're going with around a 20% chance for this, is more in line with the most recent Met Office model. So a less developed low, a slightly shallower feature, tracking somewhere around the south of the UK, southern half of the UK at least. And yes, that would bring some wet and even windy weather across southern coastal parts in particular. That's where we're most likely to see the strong winds in that setup. And further north, we're just talking sunshine and showers, really. And you'd wonder what all the fuss was about, to be honest. But then the other possibility, this only has around a 10% chance, but this is for a deeper more developed feature, a deeper low to come actually track across the country, push northeastwards across the UK. Now, if this comes off, and remember it's only around a 10% chance, but if this comes off, well then it could be very wet and it could be very windy quite widely. It could cause some issues, could be particularly hazardous, and you know, we're not at storm naming stage at the moment. It's too far ahead, confidence not anywhere near high enough. But if this came off, then we would need to be looking at naming a storm. However, the other two we probably wouldn't need to. So one to keep on top of, because it could be particularly severe, or it could just be, you know, some usual autumnal relatively wet, relatively windy weather, and exactly where we see the heaviest rain and strongest winds, well, that's still all to play for. Now, as we look further ahead, as we go through into September, there are signs that the generally unsettled theme is going to continue, although more so as we go through the third week of September, perhaps signs of higher pressure at times towards the south, so could be some quieter spells, albeit they don't look like they're going to be big blocking highs that will last for ages. It might just be some temporary ridges. But if it's drier, I know we've been crying out for wet weather through much of the summer, but I'm sure some people are now hoping for something a bit drier. If that's what you're after, well, across southern parts, there may be something on offer as we go through deeper into the month. But more on that if you watch my 14-day outlook, which will be available on the Met Office app later on today. Now, what else did I want to talk about? Let's cover sea surface temperatures. Now, I've already talked about sea surface temperatures in previous deep dives, and also on the Summer 2025 special that went out last week when I was joined by Dr. Mark McCarthy, and we touched on them then. But I still think it's quite important to cover them because we're around the peak in sea surface temperatures at the moment. I say that because if we look at the Northern Hemisphere and the Atlantic, even, then yes, it is usually early September when we see the peak in sea surface temperatures. And here behind me I have a graph plotting sea surface temperatures through the Northern Hemisphere, well, 20 north to 60 north, so kind of that middle chunk of the Northern Hemisphere for the last since 1980, so, and including this year, so the last 46 years. And the bold red line is 2025, and then the other lines are various years. And what you can see is 2025 has been consistently warmer than average for sure, and one of the warmest years in this period. Actually, it's not quite the warmest at the moment, but nonetheless, it is very high. And you can actually see that peak in the temperatures on average, the peak in this curve comes at the very end of August, beginning of September. Now, you probably know this, but in case you don't, the reason why the peak in sea surface temperatures comes a bit later than the peak in our air temperature and our land temperature is because water takes a bit longer, it takes more energy to heat up than the land does. And so there's this delay. And so that's why the sea surface temperatures stay warmer or can continue to get warmer for that little bit longer. And that's why they're at their coldest during, early spring, really, end of winter, early spring, by which time the land's actually starting to warm up. So there's always this little bit of a delay. But interestingly, across the UK, if we look much closer to home and actually just the seas around the immediate coastline, the peak on average is actually a few weeks earlier. It's more around the middle of August as when on average we see the highest temperatures. And the reason for that is because the seas around the UK are relatively shallow, definitely in comparison to the middle of the Atlantic. And as a result, the delay is less, and so it's less pronounced. And so, yes, usually the peak in our sea surface temperatures around the immediate UK coastline is in the middle of August. But actually it wasn't this year. This year it was a little bit earlier. It was in the middle of July. That's when it peaked around 16.7 Celsius. Well above average. I talked earlier about marine heat waves. We've had several of them, and that has a knock-on effect on marine life, sea life. Some species are able to adapt and move and live around the British seas, British coasts, better than they could have done before, but other species, cod for example, can't, and they move further north. But nonetheless, my point being, Temperatures through 2025 have been consistently very high, either the highest in this record period going back to 1980 or one of the highest if not. Now, they're not currently quite the highest. They've just about dipped below 16 Celsius, but for this stage in the year, they're not quite the highest. They're behind a few years. Last year, 2023, and also 2003, I think, are years that have been warmer than it at this stage in the year. But I just wanted to touch on the fact that the seas are still pretty warm. And you can see that as well if we get our anomaly chart for the sea surface temperatures, and you can see many places nearby are around a degree or so above average for this stage. This chart is from figures from yesterday, so from September the 8th. So these are comparing actual readings with the 1982 to 2011 baseline. Right, now talk about sea surface temperatures. The warm seas often have a knock-on effect on hurricanes. And in fact, you need the warm seas in order for hurricanes to develop. And actually at this time of year, we're getting very close to, traditionally, statistically, the peak in the hurricane season in the Atlantic. But actually, things currently are very quiet. Now, this chart plots the climatology, in this bluey violet coloured line, in terms of activity in the North Atlantic when it comes to tropical storms and hurricanes. And what you can see during the winter months and spring months, there's not very much activity generally, and then it starts to pick up as we go through into summer, and then it really picks up through the very end of summer, beginning of autumn, before levelling out again as we head into winter. Now, the light blue line is this year, and it got off to a quite slow start and then suddenly picked up, jumped up because of Hurricane Erin just a little while ago, but then since then has levelled out again because things have quietened down, which is an interesting one because, yeah, statistically, we're pretty much at the peak. In fact, if I show you this chart, which plots all the tropical storms, hurricanes, major hurricanes in the Atlantic throughout the year, and you can see really it is this early September period. I think technically this coming Thursday is the peak day statistically when it comes to activity in the Atlantic, but it's really quiet currently this year. Well, why is that? Well, there are a couple of things at play and still a little bit uncertain, to be honest. But last week, there was a low developing in the Atlantic, and lots of models wanted it to develop into a tropical system. In fact, I think the NHC at one point had it at around a 90% chance of developing, but that never really happened. It kind of fizzled out. And interestingly, the Google AI DeepMind model was the first to highlight that actually, no, it's not going to develop into anything tropical. It's just going to fizzle out and not become much of a feature at all. And then eventually the other models caught up, and that was right. And we're now in a quiet phase. But why didn't it develop? And that's a tricky one. There was a pulse of the Madden-Julian oscillation, which would have worked for deepening the feature. There wasn't much wind shear, so that would have contributed to it deepening, or that wouldn't have hindered its deepening either. But I've been reading some things, and they're suggesting that the air's quite dry at the moment, and the air's also quite stable. And now you need the instability and the moisture in the air. You need the instability for the parcels of air to rise up. And then as they rise up, they condense out, assuming they have that moisture. And it's that process of condensing out that leads to the energy, which then leads to the hurricanes developing, or the tropical storms. And so without the instability, without the moisture, then you're not going to get that process and create that energy. So it's probably due to a combination of things, but the drier air, the less unstable, the more stable air as well, those combined have led to it. But you would imagine that most of the models would have had a grasp of that. So it's interesting that the Google AI model captured it better, quickly, more quickly than the others. And that's also the case when it came to Hurricane Erin. The Google AI DeepMind model was also the first to track it, get the track so well, keeping it or pushing it further northwest up towards Iceland rather than more across the Atlantic. But how long's the quiet spell in terms of the hurricane season going to last? Well, there are some signs of, there's a lot of activity currently over parts of Africa, West Africa, and when we get that, then that can often lead to tropical lows developing in the Atlantic and then pushing northwestwards, and that's what a number of models here have a chart indicating the potential for lows to develop, as highlighted by a number of different models, including that Google model that I mentioned, the DeepMind, which is the orange symbols. And so, yeah, there are some signs that we could see something developing there, also some signs to the east of the US as well. So I think, things are going to stay quiet for the next week or so, but then probably going to see something a bit more active as we go through later on. But I thought it was interesting that even though statistically we're coming up to the peak in the Atlantic hurricane season, it's quite the opposite this year. Then one last thing that I wanted to talk about, and let's look globally, because whilst there is some unsettled weather in the UK, it's a very wet picture across parts of Pakistan and Western India. Now we have a monsoon low here, which has developed, and it's brought already a substantial amount of rain, and it's going to continue to bring some further heavy rain as we go through the rest of today and into tomorrow. In just that 48-hour period, some places could see 50 to 100 millimetres of rain, which means through the whole event, some places could be looking at around 250 to 350 millimetres of rain, which is well over double the average September rainfall for some of these places. So no wonder there have been some reports of flooding and landslides, and we're going to see further issues as well as a result of the very wet weather. Whilst the rain will clear away as we go through later on in the week, by Thursday time, really the worst of it will have cleared away into the ocean, there is going to be a bit of a delayed response when it comes to the river catchments, and they're looking particularly high across parts of Pakistan. Some of the rivers will be looking at a kind of a 1 in 10, 1 in 20 year event, those kind of levels. And actually across some parts of India, it could be close to a 1 in 50, 1 in 100 year event when it comes to those river levels, so particularly high. So that could lead to some further flooding as well. Fortunately, if we're trying to find something that's slightly less bad, fortunately, if I just roll back, the heaviest rain is going to be over some inland areas, but fortunately it's not pushing too far inland, not going over the really higher ground. And if it had done, then that would have led to more rain and also led to even more of a response when it comes to the river catchments, and that would have lasted even longer. So yes, there will be a short delay whilst the river levels continue to rise for a little while, but if the heaviest rain had pushed further up over the higher ground, then that would have lasted even longer. So things could have been even more severe if things had been just ever so slightly different. So that's me done. Yeah, I think that's everything that I wanted to cover today. So remember, yeah, it's quite unsettled through this week across the UK, and we are keeping a close eye on what's going to happen as we go through, particularly the back end of this coming weekend with the low pressure moving in. But exactly how deep it's going to be and the track it takes, well, that's still all to play for. Like I said, Honor will be here tomorrow with the 10-day trend. Honor and I will both be here on Friday with the Weather Studio live at 12:15. So do get those questions coming in. Hit the like button, hit the share button, and also make sure you subscribe. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget you could have watched this on Spotify instead, because we are there as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I do want to give a shout out to my wife's gran, Vivian, who sadly passed away this morning. So she was my biggest fan and will be sorely missed. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.